Hey guys, I'm Jessie, and today we are going to talk about my Cosmere reading order. There are so many ways to read Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere books. They are all interconnected, but they don't necessarily have to be read in a very specific order. And there's tons of videos, tons of posts out there talking about different Cosmere reading orders and different ways to read it to maximize your enjoyment and understanding of this massive universe that he has created. If you want to see like a bunch of different options, you can check out a blog post that I did that I'll link down below that talks about, I think, 4 or 5 different reading orders. There's chronological order, there's publication order, there is the Brandon Sanderson order, and then there is also my reading order. The order that I read the books in after doing a little bit of research after starting. And honestly, I found my way to be very enjoyable. I picked up on every little thing, and obviously there's some things I missed because I did miss some short stories. Those short stories and novellas are going to be mentioned in the blog post, but I didn't find that I missed too much by missing the few short stories that I did not get to yet. I do plan on getting to them eventually though, to go back and make sure that I'm fully connected before the 5th Stormlight book comes out. But today I'm going to kind of just go over quickly which books I read and in what order and how that contributed to my enjoyment of the series as a whole. So when I started reading Brandon Sanderson, when I started reading the Cosmere, I had no idea that this was this big interconnected universe. I just thought that the books that I picked up sounded really cool. I wanted to get to them, so I read them. And the first series that I dove right into was Mistborn Era 1. This was my very first ever experience with Brandon Sanderson, and honestly, it had me fall in love with him. I enjoyed the heck out of this world, out of the magic, out of the characters. The world building is phenomenal. And the ending of the last book is probably one of my favorite series enders ever. It was just amazing. So I read all 3 of these back to back, which we have Mistborn, the Final Empire, and then we have The Well of Ascension, and then we have The Hero of Ages. And these were my first series of Sanderson. Now, when I read these, I did not know at all that there was a Cosmere. I hadn't really discovered BookTube yet. I hadn't really discovered the Cosmere fans or the Sanderson fans, and I was just reading them because I thought they were cool. So these were my first. Honestly, I think that Mistborn is a great starting place for Sanderson. It's really easy to get into. It's a really easy world to understand. His writing is very straightforward. It's not purple. It's not flowery. The world building's a little heavy, but if you are used to reading things like YA fantasy, this is a pretty easy one to transition into reading adult fantasy because it's not going to really confuse you or frustrate you. And they're long, but they're not as long as some of his other works, some other adult fantasy books in general. So this was my first series, and this is where I also recommend starting. And still not knowing anything about the Cosmere or that it was a thing, I ended up discovering that there is a Era 2 of Mistborn. And I was like, what? How are they going to continue the series after that ending? I don't know, but I need to find out. So I picked up Alloy of Law and flew through this book. As you can see, it is a lot shorter than even the original Mistborn series. And it's a lot different. I was like, what is going on? But I had so much fun. This is more of a Western steampunk inspired. It takes place, I think, 300 years after the original. And some people don't like it as much. I personally enjoyed the heck out of it. So of course, as soon as I finished this book, I picked up the second one, and that is Shadows of Self. And while I don't think I liked them as much as Era 1, I loved them. But after I read this one, I didn't really continue on with book 3. I just didn't pick up book 3 yet because, you know, I had some stuff going on. I was busy. I had discovered book 2 by this time, and I had started reading just a bunch of other stuff. So this was my next foray into the Cosmere, and that is books 1 and 2 of Era 2. After reading those books, I had fully discovered the Cosmere. I knew that it was a thing. I had kind of discovered BookTube, and I was super excited to read more. But instead of going straight into Bands of Mourning, which is book 3 in Era 2, I jumped right into this big boy, and this is Way of Kings, the first book in the Stormlight archives. And y'all, this book is massive. Massive! This was probably like the biggest books that I had read in a very, very long time, because when I first got back into reading, I hadn't read for like 7 years or something insane like that. So I started reading Way of Kings, fell in love. The characters and the plot and the magic is so cool in this series, and I was like, I need to know more. And at this point, I hadn't seen any real like Cosmere connections. So I didn't really see this interconnected world at this point yet, but I knew it was coming and I was waiting for it, and I really enjoyed the book. After reading Way of Kings, I decided to dive into Warbreaker. Someone had told me to read Warbreaker before reading Words of Radiance, which is book 2 in the Stormlight archive, so I was like, okay. And at this point, like I said, I hadn't really seen any Cosmere connections. Like, I wasn't really sure, like, okay, these are supposed to be interconnected, but I don't see how. So I read Warbreaker, and this is a standalone for now. It ends perfectly as a standalone, but it at some point will have a sequel, which I'm excited about. But I loved this. This one was so good. And, you know, the characters in this one, again, this is probably one of the more romance-heavy of Sanderson books, and even saying that, like, it's not a lot of romance, but, like, there's some, so it kind of makes it the most romance-heavy, in my opinion. But again, this is another one where it would be a good starting point. I don't think that this is a bad book to start with. I didn't start with it, but you can start with this one or with Mistborn Era 1, and you'll be just fine. But this one is, again, it's fun, and I loved it. And then, since I was in a read-along with some friends of mine doing the Cosmere, like, crab-along, I picked up Elantris after I picked up Warbreaker. And this is Brandon Sanderson's, I believe, either first published or first written book. But it's his earliest book. And while I really enjoyed it, I still gave it 5 stars. This is probably my least favorite of his Cosmere novels. We'll get to my least favorite of his other Cosmere stuff later. But this is probably my least favorite of his Cosmere novels, but it is still really good. And again, I had not seen any Cosmere connections at this point. So I'm what, 6, 7, 8, a lot of books in. Still, I'm like, okay, like, I get it, but like, I don't get it. Like, I knew there was connections, but I was like still not seeing them come to fruition. But again, still really liked this one. Then I picked up White Sands, and that is a Cosmere aware graphic novel, and I actually did not like this one very much. I think that's not an unpopular opinion. A lot of people didn't like White Sands, and that's okay. But I only read volume 1. And apparently they are like redoing it with new art, so I'm excited to see if it improves it, because the story itself is not bad. I just couldn't get into it, and I didn't like the art very much, and it just wasn't for me. But it is an important one to read if you want every single Cosmere connection. You know what I mean? If you want all of the Cosmere books to be like, oh, like, here's this little connection, it is important to read White Sands. So I recommend it. I ended up reading it on like Kindle Unlimited. It's also in the Arcanum Unbounded, I think, which is this big old boy right here. It's in black and white in the Arcanum Unbounded, and it's only volume 1. So I would recommend reading it on like Kindle Unlimited or something along those lines if it's available. But Again, not my favorite, probably my least favorite Sanderson, but I knew there was going to be Cosmere connections, I just hadn't seen them. Then I picked up Words of Radiance, which is book 2 in the Stormlight archives. And this book is where I started to finally see all of my Cosmere connections come to fruition. It is close to the end of this book when you start to see that. And I really was like, what? By the end, I was like, wait, is that, what? That's, and it was just like one of those mind-blowing moments where everything came to fruition and I was like, okay, yes, I see it, I get it, stuff is clicking and I'm happy. This is probably one of my favorite Stormlight books. Like, Words of Radiance has my heart. Like, I love this book in the series, so I recommend getting through all of the Sanderson books, but Words of Radiance, man, it's just something special. But this is where I first started to see my Cosmere connections kind of come to fruition. After Words of Radiance, I finally circled back around to Bands of Mourning. This is the 3rd book in Era 2 Mistborn. And at the moment, it is the last book in the series. It's not the final book, but it's the last published book. There will be The Lost Metal, which is book 4, which will like wrap up Era 2, coming out later this year, which I'm super excited about. But this one was probably my favorite in Era 2. It really tied Era 1 and Era 2 together, and you can start to see more Cosmere connections in it. Like, you can finally see things coming together in the Mistborn world in this book, and I was like, what? There were connections and I loved them and I really enjoyed this one. So even if you didn't love the first 2, I think this one really ties Era 1 and 2 together. And like, I liked books 1 and 2 of Era 2 more after I read this one, if that makes sense. Immediately after that, I dove into my Arcanum Unbounded and read Mistborn, A Secret History, which changes everything. It changes everything. Technically, I think you can read this before Era 2, but you cannot read this until you have finished Era 1, or else it's like massive plot spoilers, right? So, Mistborn, A Secret History is a like short story that he did that takes place during the same time as Era 1. So from the end of book 1 to the end of book 3, this short story takes place. And you are just like, whoa. Like, so many things click and make sense, and so many things you never thought about. And then there is definite crossover into Bands of Mourning, which is why a lot of people say not to read it until you've finished Bands of Mourning. Honestly, I don't think it has any spoilers for Era 2 because we're literally just in Era 1 the entire time. But there's crossover to Era 2, which makes it make sense. And you're like, what? So definitely read this one. If you don't read any of the other short stories, you have to read Mistborn, A Secret History. All right, so after finishing that, then I dove into another short story, and that is Edge Dancer. This takes place between books 2 and 3 of the Stormlight archives, and it follows Lift, who is one of our interlude characters that we get in book 2. And it expands upon her story because she is going to become a more important character in books 3 and 4 and on in the Stormlight archives. And I know some people didn't like this because they didn't like Lift. I love Lift. I think she's just adorable. Like, she's a kid. She's a little young teenager and she acts like it. And I love her and she likes to eat and she's awesome. And I really liked Edge Dancer. I think it expanded upon it, and I think it's important to read between the two. Like, it's someone that's like required reading, right? Like, you need to read this for more things to make sense. And I enjoyed it. Then we dove right into Oathbringer, which is the third book in the Stormlight Archives. Again, this book is massive. All the Stormlight Archives books are massive. And then again, in this one, you start to see much more Cosmere crossover. You start to really pick out and notice different little things that Sanderson has put in here that you're like, oh, this may be from Mistborn, or this may be a character from here or here. And you really get a lot of crossover with Warbreaker in this book. And I absolutely loved it. And I know this one might be a lot of people's least favorite Stormlight books because I don't like Dalinar's perspective. I, on the other hand, could not agree less. I loved Dalinar's perspective. I loved this book. And it was just fun. And I like picking out all the Cosmere things from across different worlds. And you're like, wait, what? And like your characters in this book start to be slightly Cosmere aware. They start to realize as well that there is a bigger world out there, not just them. So it's really, really cool to just see that unfold. After Oathbringer, I read the novella Dawnshard, which takes place between Oathbringer and Rhythm of War. Again, we just kind of get a lot more opening up of the world with side characters. We get the Lopen, and we get our first Cosmere dragon-esque character, and there are actually some little Cosmere connects in it that I really appreciated, and it kind of opens up the world and it sets up some important plot points that you need to know going into Rhythm of War. And finally, we finished it off with Rhythm of War. This book has the most Cosmere connections just thrown everywhere of all of the books, and I loved it. So this really is the book where it's like the big time payoff. You see people and things and references to Elantris, to Warbreaker, to Mistborn, both eras. And it's like, what? Like everything is making sense now. And it kind of scares me for book 5 because I'm like, what's gonna happen? But honestly, this book really culminates everything in the Cosmere connection space really well, in my opinion. So I think he did a great job with it, and I'm excited to see like where he goes next. So that is how I read the Cosmere. Like I said, there is no right way, wrong way. I have a blog post with like 5 or 6 different ways that you could read the Cosmere and why they're good and why they might not be for you. So go check that out if you want to. I'll leave it linked. But this was my personal reading order and how I read them and how I enjoyed them and why I enjoyed them the way I did. Let me know what your thoughts are on like Cosmere reading order. How did you read it? How are you reading it? Did you even know the Cosmere was a thing when you got started? Because I did not. Like I said, I read all of Mistborn Era 1 without knowing like that Sanderson was like this big deal and like the Cosmere was a thing. So let me know your thoughts on Cosmere reading orders. All right. Thank you guys for hanging out with me. My name is Jessie and I will see you next time. Bye.